The old roads of the Cotswolds were never meant to be hurried. Long before signposts, before maps folded neatly into pockets, people moved through this landscape by habit and memory, following tracks worn into the ground by feet, hooves, and wheels, year after year, century after century. Some of those roads still exist, others have faded, narrowed, or slipped quietly out of use. And a few, it is said, never entirely forgot the people who traveled them. Crossroads, in particular, have always carried a certain unease. They are places of decision, of hesitation, where one path must be chosen and another left behind. In folklore, they were places to avoid at night, places where the rules were less certain, not because something waited there exactly, but because not everything that arrived was able to leave. Across the Cotswolds, old paths cross open commons, cut between dry stone walls, and vanish into woods or fields without warning. Funeral routes once carried the dead to distant churches. Milestones marked not just distance but progress or delay. Fingerposts pointed the way for travelers who trusted them, sometimes a little too readily. And now and then, on the quietest roads, something could be found already waiting, as though it had arrived long before it was needed. Tonight's stories are drawn from those places. They are not tales of pursuit or panic, but of walking, of stopping, of choosing when to continue and when to turn back. They are stories shaped by repetition and familiarity, by roads taken so often they began to remember the people who walked them. As you listen, there is no need to stay alert. These are old paths, and they will unfold at their own pace. You do not need to follow every detail or hold on to every name. Simply imagine the sound of footsteps on gravel, the open sky above a wide common, the quiet creak of wood and leather somewhere ahead on the road. And when you reach a crossroads, as everyone eventually does, you may find that the most important thing is not which way you go, but that you are not in a hurry to arrive. Arthur Bell had crossed the common more times than he could remember. It was the quickest way home from Stroud in the evening, a wide stretch of open ground where the paths crossed and divided like faint lines scratched into stone. In daylight, Minchinhampton Common felt open and generous, its long grass moving in the wind, skylarks rising above it without warning. But at night, the space changed. The horizon pulled away, sounds traveled further than they should have, and the paths, so clear by day, lost their certainty. Arthur had grown up nearby. He knew the common well enough to cross it without thinking, even after dark, especially after dark. There was something about the walk that settled him, that slowed his thoughts and loosened the day from his shoulders. He liked the way the ground opened out beneath the sky, the sense that nothing was hidden. In daylight, the common belonged to dog walkers and grazing cattle, to people who crossed it without noticing the paths beneath their feet. In the evenings, it belonged to no one in particular. Arthur often adjusted his pace without realizing it, slowing as the land flattened, matching his steps to the rhythm of the wind in the grass. There were moments, especially when the light was fading, when he felt less like a man crossing the common and more like part of a longer movement, one of many who had walked the same way for reasons both ordinary and forgotten. It was on one of those evenings, calm, overcast, the air heavy but not cold, that he first noticed the hesitation. He had reached the crossroads near the center of the common, where several old tracks met. No sign marked it, no stone or post, just the way the grass flattened into pale lines, worn thin by centuries of feet, hooves, and wheels. Arthur had passed through that crossing countless times. He always bore slightly left, following the path that led down toward the lights of the valley. That night, without meaning to, he stopped. He could not have said why. There was no sound to distract him, no movement to catch his eye. Yet his feet halted at the meeting of the paths, and for a moment he simply stood there, looking down at the ground. The grass at the crossroads was shorter than elsewhere, pressed low, almost polished. It looked handled, as though many people had paused there before him, long enough to leave something behind. Arthur shook the thought away and continued on, telling himself he was tired. But the following evening, it happened again. This time, the hesitation lasted longer. He stopped at the same place, aware of the paths stretching away from him in several directions. One led back the way he had come. One climbed gently toward the edge of the common. Another slipped down into shadow, toward hedges and enclosed fields. And the one he usually took lay somewhere between, familiar and unremarkable. Arthur felt, quite suddenly, that choosing the wrong one would matter. He stood there longer than he intended, his breathing slow, listening. The common was quiet, but not empty. A breeze moved through the grass. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and fell silent. The sky pressed low, without stars. When he finally stepped forward, relief followed him like warmth. Over the next week, the hesitation became a habit. Arthur did not speak of it. He told no one. He simply allowed a little more time for his walk home. He would arrive at the crossroads, slow his pace, and stop. Sometimes he closed his eyes. Sometimes he looked at the paths as though one of them might change when he wasn't watching. Nothing ever did, and yet something felt wrong. One evening, as he stood there longer than usual, he became aware that he was not alone. The sensation came first, a pressure, a subtle gathering, and then the sound, a footstep perhaps, or the suggestion of one. Arthur turned, expecting to see another walker crossing the common, but there was no one there. Then he noticed the figures. They were not standing in the paths exactly. They stood just off them, at the edges, where the grass grew slightly higher. There were 3 at first, then more. They did not approach, they did not retreat, they simply waited. Arthur could not see their faces clearly. They were darker than the night around them, shapes cut from shadow. He felt no fear, only a strange, quiet certainty that if he spoke, they would listen. He did not speak. Instead, he realized what they were doing. They were waiting to be directed. The thought arrived fully formed without explanation. These were people who had reached the crossroads and could not decide, or had been denied the choice altogether. People brought here deliberately, turned away from the paths they knew, set down where directions failed. Arthur remembered stories his grandmother had told him, half remembered and dismissed at the time, of crossroads burials, of bodies brought to places like this under cover of night, not laid to rest, but confused, turned, sent nowhere. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped onto the path that led home. The figures did not follow, but the next night there were more of them. They gathered silently at the edges of the crossing, some closer than before. Arthur sensed no anger in them, no urgency, only expectation. He realized with a creeping unease that they were not bound to the place, not entirely. They were bound to the decision. Each time someone passed through, they waited to see what would be chosen. Arthur shortened his walks. He avoided the common when he could, taking longer routes through lit streets and familiar lanes. But habit is difficult to break, and one evening, without thinking, he found himself walking back across the open ground once more. The common was heavy with mist. The crossroads appeared suddenly, the paths fading in and out of view. Arthur slowed. He told himself not to stop. He told himself the figures were nothing more than imagination. But when he reached the center, he found that someone else was already there. A man stood with his back to Arthur, his coat old-fashioned, his posture uncertain. He did not move, even when Arthur approached. "Are you lost?" Arthur asked softly. The man turned his head slightly, just enough for Arthur to see that his face was pale and unfocused, as though he were looking at something far beyond the common. "I was told to wait," the man said. Arthur swallowed. "Who told you?" The man did not answer. The figures at the edge of the paths seemed closer now, their presence thickening the air. Arthur understood, with a sudden clarity, that this man had been brought here deliberately, long ago, turned away from where he belonged, left at the meeting of paths so he would never quite arrive. Arthur stepped forward. He raised his arm slowly and pointed, not back the way he had come, not toward the darker paths. He pointed along the one that led gently downward, toward the valley lights. The man looked at Arthur's hand, then at the path. He hesitated, just as Arthur always did, and then took a single step forward. The figures receded. Arthur did not wait to see where the man went. He turned and walked home by another route, his heart steady, his thoughts calm. He did not cross the common again for some time. When he eventually did, months later, the crossroads felt different. The grass still lay flat, the paths still met and parted, but the sense of waiting had gone. Arthur paused there once, just briefly, out of habit. Then he continued on without stopping. He noticed, as he walked away, that his steps felt lighter, as though the decision had already been made for him. The paths no longer seemed to lean inward, no longer asked for his attention. They simply lay where they always had, open and unremarkable, as paths are meant to be. The common returned to its quiet ways. Skylarks rose in daylight. Mist drifted across the ground at dusk. Walkers crossed and recrossed the paths without noticing where they met. But sometimes, when the light is low and the air is still, a pause lingers at that crossing, not of fear, but of memory. A reminder that some places were never meant to be passed through without care. Edwin Mercer first noticed the path because it felt older than the land around it. He had moved to Lower Slaughters in late autumn, when the village had already begun to settle into itself. The tourists were fewer, the lanes quieter, the river slower beneath its stone bridges. Edwin welcomed the stillness. After years in towns where every street seemed to change faster than memory could keep up, he liked the sense that things here remained where they were put. The footpath ran behind the cottage he rented, slipping between hedges and fields before climbing gently toward higher ground. It was not marked clearly on the map he kept folded by the door. It appeared as a dotted line, faint and uncertain, as though the cartographer had not been entirely convinced it belonged there. Edwin walked it most evenings. Sometimes he set out just before dusk, when the fields still held the day's warmth and the river below the village reflected a pale, thinning sky. Other times he waited until night had settled more firmly, when the cottages lay quiet behind him and the path ahead seemed to offer itself willingly, as though relieved to be used again. Edwin noticed that his thoughts grew simpler once he stepped onto the track. Concerns that had followed him all day loosened their hold, replaced by the small, steady work of placing one foot after another. The path did not rush him. It accepted whatever pace he brought and returned it unchanged. At first, he told himself it was for exercise or fresh air, but gradually he realized he liked the way the path carried him forward without asking very much in return. The ground beneath his boots was firm, worn smooth by use. The hedges leaned inward, but not enough to crowd him. Even in low light, the way ahead seemed clear. The path always led him toward Stow-on-the-Wold. He did not intend to walk that far. He rarely reached the town itself. Instead, he would follow the route for a while, then turn back when the light faded or the air cooled. Yet, no matter how far he went, The path seemed content, as though it had been waiting for him to step onto it again. One evening, as he paused beside a field gate, Edwin noticed something strange. There were no footprints ahead of him. The grass on either side of the path bore the marks of animals and walkers alike, but the pale strip of earth itself lay undisturbed, smooth and unbroken, as though nothing had passed along it for some time. Edwin frowned, then looked back the way he had come. Behind him, his own footprints faded quickly, already softening into the ground. The path, he realized, did not hold on to marks for long. He thought nothing more of it. It was only later, after several weeks of walking the same route, that Edwin began to feel a faint pull, not forward exactly, but backward, a sense that the path knew where it was going, regardless of whether he did. One night, as he returned home later than usual, he found himself walking more slowly, his steps falling into an unfamiliar rhythm. It felt ceremonial, though he could not have said why. He kept his eyes on the pale strip ahead, noticing how it curved gently, how it avoided the lowest ground, how it seemed to choose the easiest passage through the land. He became aware, with a quiet certainty, that the path did not exist for the living. The thought did not frighten him. It simply settled into place. Edwin remembered something he had read once years ago. A passing reference to old funeral routes, paths used to carry the dead from outlying villages to their nearest churchyards. Corpse roads, they had been called. Routes walked so often by bearers and mourners that they became fixed, not just in the land, but in memory. Once walked, always remembered. That night, as Edwin turned back toward Lower Slaughters, he felt a brief resistance beneath his feet, as though the ground itself was surprised by the change of direction. The following evening, he did not turn back. He walked until the fields widened and the land lifted, until the glow of distant lights suggested the edge of Stow on the Wold. He stopped before reaching the town, standing quietly as the path narrowed beneath him. For the first time, he sensed that he was not walking alone. There was no sound of footsteps, no breath at his shoulder. Instead, there was a presence, a steadiness, as though others moved with him at a pace just slower than his own. Edwin felt no fear, only an odd sense of courtesy, as though he were expected to keep his place. He became acutely aware of spacing, the instinctive courtesy of keeping distance, of not stepping too close or lagging behind. His pace adjusted without conscious effort, slowing slightly, then settling. It felt important not to hurry, though he could not have explained why. Edwin realized then that the path did not merely guide direction, it governed behavior. It asked for steadiness, for attention, for respect. Those who walked it did so on its terms, whether they knew it or not. He stepped aside instinctively, moving to the edge of the path. Nothing passed him, but the sensation lingered. Over the next few days, Edwin noticed changes, small ones at first. The path seemed clearer at dusk than it did by daylight. Its pale surface caught the fading light, while the surrounding grass darkened. More than once, Edwin found himself stepping onto it without quite remembering leaving the cottage. On one such evening, he heard a sound he could not place. It was a low creak, followed by the soft scrape of wood against earth. Edwin slowed, listening. The sound did not come from behind him, nor ahead. It seemed to rise from the path itself, like an echo remembered rather than heard. He understood then what he was sensing. The path remembered weight, not footsteps exactly, but burden. The steady, measured strain of men carrying something carefully between them. The way a body changes the rhythm of a walk, demands attention, slows every movement. Edwin stopped. For a long moment he stood with his head bowed, aware of the faint press of something passing him, close enough that he felt the air shift. He did not look up. It seemed impolite to do so. When he reached the turning point that usually sent him home, Edwin found he could not bring himself to leave the path. Instead, he continued towards Stow-on-the-Wold. The churchyard lay quiet when he arrived, its stones pale in the low light. Edwin did not enter. He stopped at the edge, standing where the path seemed to loosen its hold on him at last. He felt an unmistakable sense of arrival. That night, he slept deeply. After that, the path changed. It no longer drew him forward so insistently. He could turn back without resistance. The sense of company faded. Yet Edwin knew without doubt that the path remained what it had always been, a way remembered. Even now, Edwin suspected that if he were to walk the path at the wrong pace, too fast, too light, it would feel different beneath his feet, not hostile but closed, as though withholding something. The thought did not trouble him. He had learned, after all, that some routes reveal themselves only when approached in the proper manner. Weeks later, while speaking to a neighbor, Edwin mentioned his evening walks. "There's an old route that way," the man said casually. "Used to carry the dead up to Stow before we had our own ground. Folk don't talk about it much." Edwin nodded, as though this confirmed something he already knew. He walked the path less often after that, but when he did, he kept to the center, careful not to hurry, careful not to break the rhythm. And sometimes, when the air is still and the light is low, the path grows pale again beneath his feet, not because it wishes to be walked, but because it remembers how. Thomas Hale noticed the milestone because it was not where he expected it to be. He walked the same stretch of the old road most evenings, following a quiet section of the Fossway where the modern lane ran close to the Roman line but never quite overlapped it. The traffic thinned quickly once he left the town behind, and before long the road narrowed, bordered by hedges and fields that felt older than their boundaries suggested. Thomas liked the walk for its regularity. The ground underfoot was firm, the route predictable. It gave shape to the end of the day, marking time more reliably than clocks ever seemed to. The milestone stood just beyond a shallow bend. It was low and worn, its surface softened by centuries of weather. Moss gathered in its shallow grooves, blurring whatever inscription had once been cut there. Thomas had passed it many times without stopping. He could not have said what distance it marked, or even whether it marked anything at all. That evening he paused beside it without quite knowing why. The stone leaned slightly toward the road, as though listening. Thomas rested his hand on its surface. It was cool, even in summer, and faintly damp. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended, then continued on his way. The next evening, the milestone seemed closer to the bend, not much closer, just enough that Thomas noticed the difference. He told himself it was nothing. A trick of memory, perhaps, or the way the light fell at that hour, flattening distances and softening edges. He walked on, and the thought left him. But over the following days, he found himself watching for the stone. It did not move in any obvious way. It did not change position while he looked at it. Yet each time he approached, it felt as though it were meeting him sooner than before, as though the road between them had shortened. Thomas began to slow his pace as he drew near. He found that if he walked more deliberately, counting his steps without meaning to, the stone seemed to settle back into place. If he hurried, it appeared sooner. The realization was faint, half-formed, but it stayed with him. One evening, he stopped directly in front of it. The inscription was barely legible now, its edges rounded and broken. Thomas brushed away a little moss with his thumb, revealing a shallow groove that might once have been a numeral, or a mark of some other kind. He felt then a peculiar sense of attention. Not pressure, not threat, simply the awareness of being noticed. Thomas laughed quietly at himself and stepped away. That night he dreamed of roads, not of traveling them, but of standing beside them, watching others pass, men in cloaks and boots, carts creaking slowly, figures moving at different speeds, all following the same line. Some passed once, some returned again and again. The road did not change for them, it only received them. When he woke, the dream stayed with him longer than usual. Over the next weeks, the milestone became a marker in a different sense. Thomas noticed that on evenings when he felt restless or distracted, the stone seemed closer, almost eager. On nights when he walked calmly, letting his thoughts drift, it waited for him where it always had. He began to understand, without quite admitting it to himself, that the stone was not measuring distance. It was measuring return. The thought should have reassured him. Instead, it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately name. Thomas realized that return did not necessarily imply choice. The road did not ask why someone came back. It only acknowledged that they had. That night, for the first time, he wondered whether the stone counted him only when he walked, or whether it remembered him even when he stayed away. The idea felt strangely reasonable. Roman milestones, he knew, had been set to mark progress along the road, to give travelers a sense of how far they had come and how far remained. But this one had stood here for much longer than any single journey. It had watched generations pass, had felt the vibration of countless footsteps and wheels. What use would miles be to something that never moved? One evening, as dusk gathered quickly, Thomas noticed a number scratched faintly into the stone's surface. He was certain it had not been there before. It was not deeply cut nor neatly shaped. It looked more like a tally mark than a numeral, a shallow line that caught the fading light at a certain angle. Thomas leaned closer, tracing it with his eye. As he did, a quiet certainty settled over him. The mark had not been carved by hand. It had appeared. He stepped back, unsettled, then forced himself to breathe more slowly. The road lay empty in both directions. The hedges whispered faintly in the breeze. Nothing else had changed. The next evening, there were 2 marks. Thomas did not touch the stone again. Instead, he began to experiment. On some nights, he walked past the milestone without stopping, barely glancing at it. On others, he paused deliberately, standing still until the light shifted and the road grew quiet around him. The marks changed accordingly. They did not count nights, nor did they count hours. They counted arrival. Each time Thomas truly noticed the stone, each time he acknowledged it, however briefly, the tally increased. The realization did not frighten him. It made him thoughtful. He began to wonder how many times he had walked this road before the stone had begun to count him. How many passings were required before noticing became recognition. Thomas did not walk the road the following night. The weather was poor, the wind sharp enough to rattle the hedges, and he told himself there was no need to go out. Yet the decision troubled him more than it should have. He slept badly, waking more than once, with the sense of having forgotten something important. When he returned to the road the next evening, there were 3 marks on the stone. Thomas stood very still, aware that one of them did not belong to a walk he could remember taking. One evening, he arrived at the milestone and found an elderly man standing beside it. The man was not touching the stone. He stood a little way back, his hands clasped loosely behind him, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Good evening," Thomas said after a moment. The man nodded. "It's a faithful thing," he replied. Thomas hesitated. "The stone?" "Yes," the man said. "It keeps better records than we do." They stood together in silence for a while. "Does it mark distance?" Thomas asked at last. The man smiled faintly. "Not any longer." When Thomas looked again, the man had gone. The milestone remained. That night, Thomas dreamed again of roads. This time, he stood beside the stone, watching himself pass again and again, Each time he returned, the tally deepened, not as a warning, not as a judgment, simply as a record. He woke with a sense of calm acceptance. From then on, Thomas walked the Fossway differently. He no longer hurried. He no longer tried to predict where the milestone would appear. He accepted its presence as part of the route, no more remarkable than the bend in the road or the shape of the hedges. The tally continued to grow. Thomas did not know what would happen when the marks filled the stone, or whether such a thing was even possible. He suspected it was not meant to be reached within a single lifetime. The stone had all the time it required. Thomas understood then that the tally was not meant to be completed. It was not moving toward an end. It was simply continuing. As roads do, long after the feet that first wore them down have gone. The fear, when it came, was quiet and lasting, not of what would happen when the stone finished counting, but of what it meant that it never would. Years later, when Thomas no longer walked the road as often, the milestone remained where it had always been. Moss gathered, rain softened its edges. The tally marks blurred and faded, replaced slowly by others. And sometimes, when a familiar figure approaches along the old Roman line, the distance between road and stone seems to shorten, not to hurry them along, but to acknowledge their return. Martin Ellison first noticed the finger post because it was facing the wrong way. He had walked that track many times before, following the edge of Wychwood Forest, where the trees thinned into hedgerow and open ground. The path was old but clear, used often enough by walkers to remain visible even after rain. Martin liked it because it did not demand attention. It allowed his thoughts to drift. The finger post stood at a shallow fork where the track divided, its arms pale against the darkening trees. Martin was used to seeing it from behind as he passed. That evening, for reasons he could not immediately explain, he found himself looking directly at it instead. The arm pointing left read, Charlbury, as it always had. The arm pointing right read, no lettering at all, just bare, weathered wood. Martin frowned. He was certain there had once been a destination carved there. He could not remember what it was, only that the space should not have been empty. He stood for a moment, listening to the forest settle around him, then shrugged and continued along the left-hand path. He did not look back. The next time he passed the finger post, the lettering had returned. The right-hand arm now read Ascot, though the carving looked shallow and uneven, as if it had been done in haste. Martin slowed, puzzled. Ascot lay in the opposite direction, further south, not through the forest. He reached out and touched the wood. It felt warm, not sun-warmed. The light had already faded, but faintly, unpleasantly warm, like something that had recently been held. Martin withdrew his hand and walked on more quickly than usual. That night, he dreamed of paths, not of walking them, but of standing at their crossings, watching others hesitate. Each time someone asked for directions, the answer changed. The forest listened. The signs obliged. When he woke, the dream clung to him like damp. Over the following week, Martin found himself thinking about the finger post more often than he liked. He tried to convince himself that the changes were ordinary enough. Vandalism, perhaps, or repairs poorly done. Yet something about the inconsistency troubled him. On Thursday evening, he returned to the fork deliberately. The forest was darker than usual, the canopy closing overhead. The finger post stood where it always had, but the arms had changed again. The left-hand arm still read Charlbury. The right-hand arm now read Home. Martin stared at it. The word was neatly carved, deeper than the others, its edges sharp and clean. It looked new. Too new. There's no way, he murmured. He glanced down the right-hand path. It dipped immediately into denser trees, the ground uneven, the light thinning quickly. Martin had never taken that route. He was certain it did not lead anywhere he recognized. The word home seemed to press against his attention. Martin became aware with a quiet unease that the word felt familiar in the wrong way. Not comforting, not welcoming, but intimate, as though it belonged to him without his consent. For a moment, absurd and fleeting, he had the impression that the carving was unfinished, that if he waited long enough, the wood might shift again, reshaping itself into something more specific. He stepped away from the sign quickly, unwilling to test the thought. Martin laughed quietly, the sound thin and unconvincing, and turned left. As he walked away, he became aware of a strange sensation, not being followed, but being counted, as though something behind him were marking the choice. That night, he dreamed again. This time, he followed the right-hand path. The trees closed behind him without sound. The ground rose and fell unpredictably. Each time he reached another fork, the sign pointed only one way: home. He woke before he reached it. Martin avoided the forest for several days after that. He took longer routes, stuck to lanes with lights, told himself there was nothing to be gained by indulging his imagination. On the fifth evening, he gave in. The fingerpost waited for him. Both arms now read, home. Martin felt his mouth go dry. He stood there longer than he meant to, listening to the faint creak of the wood as it shifted slightly in the breeze. The forest seemed very still, as though holding itself back. He noticed then something else. The paths themselves looked different. The left-hand track, the one he had always taken, appeared narrower, less certain, its edges softening into leaf litter. The right-hand path looked clearer than before, the ground pressed flat, as though it had been used recently. Recently by whom, he could not say. Martin took a step backward. The forest answered with silence. He became acutely aware that he could no longer remember, with absolute certainty, which way he had come. The realization was small, but devastating. He forced himself to breathe slowly and chose the left-hand path, relying on habit rather than confidence. As he walked, the trees seemed closer together than before. The light faded quickly, though his watch told him very little time had passed. When he reached the edge of the forest, relief came so sharply it left him weak. He did not sleep that night. The next evening, Martin found the fingerpost gone. Only the post remained, the arms removed cleanly, the wood pale where they had been fixed. The fork looked suddenly unfamiliar without it, the paths less distinct. Without the sign, the fork felt wrong, not neutral, but expectant. Martin stood between the two paths, unsettled by how similar they now appeared. The ground underfoot was equally worn, the trees on either side equally close. He realized with growing discomfort that the sign had not merely indicated direction, it had created difference. Without it, the paths offered no distinction at all. Martin chose one at random and walked for several minutes before stopping, suddenly unsure whether he was moving away from the forest or deeper into it. He returned the way he thought he had come, heart steady but cold. A sound came from the right-hand path. Not footsteps, something slower. The deliberate shift of weight through leaves. Martin did not wait to identify it. He turned and walked quickly away. The forest did not follow. 2 days later, a notice appeared on the edge of the village. Walker missing. Last seen near Witchwood Forest. Martin stopped in front of it longer than he intended. The name meant nothing to him. The photograph showed a man about his age, wearing a coat similar to his own. That evening, the fingerpost had returned. It stood at the fork as before, whole again, its arms freshly carved. The left-hand arm read Charlbury. The right-hand arm read the missing man's name. Martin stepped back, horror blooming slowly, rather than sharply. He understood then, with terrible clarity. Martin did not read the name aloud. Even so, he felt the shape of it settle uncomfortably in his thoughts. He imagined how it must have looked on the sign the first time, freshly carved, precise, unquestioned. He wondered how long the name would remain there, whether it would weather slowly or vanish all at once, leaving the wood blank again, waiting. The fingerpost did not point to places. It pointed to where people belonged next. The word home, he realized, had not been a promise. It had been a conclusion. Martin did not return to the forest after that. He moved away within the month, took a job elsewhere, avoided wooded paths whenever he could. After he left the village, Martin began to notice signs more often than he should have. Not fingerposts exactly. Sometimes just boards or markers or arrows at the edges of places. Now and then, he would realize that one of them had been turned slightly, its face angled toward him rather than the road. He never stopped to read them. He did not need to. And once, years later, on a quiet lane at dusk, he passed a fingerpost with no names at all. Just one arm, newly carved. It pointed toward him. Alistair Croak first came to the Rollright Stones by accident. He had been driving through the Cotswolds with no real destination in mind, following smaller roads that wandered between fields without explanation. When he saw the sign for the stones, he turned almost without thinking, as though the lane itself had suggested it. He parked in a shallow lay-by and walked the short distance to the site. It was quieter than he expected. No voices, no movement beyond the soft stir of grass and leaves. The stones stood in their familiar groupings. The king's men arranged in a broad circle, the whispering knights leaning together nearby, and the lone king stone standing apart, slightly removed from the rest. Alistair did not believe in curses, but he did believe in places that made certain thoughts feel more likely. He walked slowly, keeping to the path. The stones did not announce themselves. Their presence was steady, uninterested in being impressive. At the edge of the king's men, he paused. In the dimming light, the circle looked less like a monument and more like something unfinished, a decision interrupted and never corrected. He wondered briefly what it would feel like to stand inside it after dark. The thought was mild. Then he felt it, the faintest tug of attention, as though someone had spoken his name very softly from behind him. He turned. No one stood there. The grass shifted. A bird lifted from the hedge and vanished. Alistair exhaled, amused with himself, and continued on. He walked toward the whispering knights. Up close, they leaned together like figures in quiet discussion, their shadows merging at their bases. Alistair found himself lowering his voice without realizing it. It felt impolite to speak aloud. When he stepped away, he noticed his footprints in the grass were barely visible. The ground looked dry enough to hold them, yet the blades sprang back almost immediately, smoothing themselves as though disturbance were unwelcome. He told himself it meant nothing. He moved on to the king's stone. It was taller than he expected, its surface rough and irregular. Alistair placed his hand against it. Cool. Then, beneath that, the suggestion of warmth. Not sun-warmed, but something older, like heat remembered rather than held. He withdrew his hand at once. A strange idea came to him then, that the stone knew the difference between a hand that touched briefly and one that lingered. The light was fading quickly now. Shadows pooled between stones. Alistair checked his phone, but the screen would not wake. He frowned and put it away. He should leave, he thought. Instead, he found himself walking back toward the king's men. The stones seemed closer together than before, not by much. Just enough that the space between them felt tighter, more deliberate. Alistair walked the perimeter slowly, counting without meaning to. He lost count and began again. At the point where he had first approached, the grass lay flattened, as though someone had been standing there. The certainty came to him without drama. Someone else had been here. Not earlier, not yesterday, just now. He turned slowly. There was no one. But the silence felt heavier, shaped, as though holding its breath. Alistair forced himself to move, reminding himself that the lane was close. He turned back toward the exit. Halfway along the path, he stopped. The Whispering Knights were angled differently, not displaced, not rearranged, turned, as though the conversation they had been holding had shifted, and one of them had leaned toward a new speaker. Alistair swallowed. If they can turn once, the thought came calmly, they can turn again. He walked faster, refusing to look back. The gap in the trees was gone, not blocked, simply reduced, rearranged into a narrow passage that did not feel like an exit at all. Alistair stopped, heart steady but cold, and turned back toward the stones. They stood as before. For a moment, relief washed through him. Then he noticed the king's stone again. It was not leaning, it was turning, not visibly, not with motion, but with intention. The face of it had altered just enough that Alistair no longer felt he was looking at the same surface he had touched earlier. He stepped back. The grass beneath his foot flattened and stayed flat. He looked down. The print was not his. It was larger, deeper, its edges softened by time. A footprint pressed into the earth long ago and only now revealed, waiting. A childhood story surfaced in his mind. A king and his men turned to stone by a curse, halted mid-march. A tale repeated because it belonged to the land. But standing there, Alistair understood something else. The story was not about punishment. It was about interruption. The king had been stopped mid-step, mid-turn, mid-decision, and unfinished things did not fade. They waited. He backed away slowly, moving toward the king's men. Inside the circle, perhaps, there would be order, shape, boundary. At the edge of the stones, he stopped. The grass held more impressions, not fresh footprints, but revealed ones. A ring of them, evenly spaced, facing inward. Men had once stood here. The circle was not stones arranged like men. It was men arranged like stones. A formation. And formations had purpose. Alistair felt the fear settle, heavy and calm. The place did not want him to run. It wanted him to choose. A faint scrape came from the Whispering Knights. Stone against stone. They were closer together now, preparing. Alistair did not run. He stepped into the circle. The ground inside the ring felt subtly different beneath his feet. Not softer, not firmer. Simply more aware, as though the earth recognized the weight placed upon it. Alistair stood very still, conscious of how precisely he occupied the space. He noticed then that the impressions in the grass were not random. Each was aligned, facing inward, angled toward the center where he now stood. They were not marks left by wandering. They were positions. Alistair became acutely aware of his own posture, the way his shoulders were set, the balance of his stance. He had the unsettling sense that if he shifted too far in any direction, he would be correcting something long out of place. The stones themselves did not move, yet he felt with absolute certainty that their attention had narrowed, not focused on his face or his hands, but on his presence, the fact of him occupying a space that had been measured before. A thought surfaced, uninvited but calm. The circle did not require completion. It only required continuity. Alistair realized then that stepping inside had not been a test. It had been an answer. He wondered briefly how long one could stand there before becoming indistinguishable from the thing being stood among. The idea did not arrive with panic, but with a slow, suffocating logic, as though the circle were not asking him to remain forever, only to remain long enough. The air inside felt held, contained. His breathing sounded too loud, too alive. The stones did not move, but he knew they were aware of him now, the way a room becomes aware of a flame. He closed his eyes. He saw the circle from above, the king stone turning endlessly, never reaching its final face. The whispering knights adjusting their lean by fractions, and himself, standing exactly where he stood, his feet fitting perfectly into the earth's remembered shapes. When he opened his eyes, the lane was there, wide, ordinary. Alistair did not question it. He left at an even pace, careful not to hurry. He found his car and drove away without looking back. He did not return. But years later, when he heard the stones mentioned casually, he would feel something mark itself inside him, a quiet recognition, like a tally being kept, because he understood now what the curse truly was. Not that men were turned to stone, but that stone, given time, could learn the shape of a man. And once it learned you, it did not forget. The old roads do not ask us to remember them. They continue whether we walk them or not, through fields, across commons, beneath trees that have learned to stand still for centuries at a time. Tonight, you've traveled only in thought, passing places where footsteps linger longer than names, and where the land remembers more than it explains. If any of these paths felt familiar, there is no need to wonder why. Old routes have a way of recognizing us, not because we belong to them, but because they have seen so many pass before. Kings and laborers, travelers and mourners, those who arrived by choice and those who simply found themselves there, all moved on eventually, even if the ground kept quiet note of their passing. Now, though, there is no need to keep walking. The roads you followed tonight can return to their silence. The stones can finish their turning without you. The signs can face whichever way they please. You are not required to choose a direction or to stand in any particular place. You are already where you need to be. Allow the weight of the day to settle and loosen. Let the sound of your own breathing become the only rhythm that matters. Whatever these old places may remember, they do not follow you beyond the edge of sleep. The paths fade now. The stones grow still, and the night, like the land itself, is content to hold you quietly and let you rest. Sleep well. Please subscribe to this channel to be alerted to the next episode of Ghosts of the Cotswolds.